Sometimes the hardest thing in life is returning to a place where your heart was broken. For Elijah Wade, that place was a weathered shack in the Montana wilderness where the woman he loved had died 10 winters ago. He'd sworn never to go back, but tonight something pulled him through those pine trees like a man walking toward his own grave. His 3 dogs knew something was wrong before he did. They pressed against his legs, trembling and whimpering as they approached the old cabin. The front door hung open in the evening breeze. Inside, a lantern burned with fresh flame on the table where he'd last seen her face. Next to it lay an open journal with pages that looked new, written in handwriting he'd never forget. The same delicate script that had once written him love letters. But she'd been dead for a decade. Who had lit that lantern and written those fresh words? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Elijah Wade stood frozen in the doorway, his weathered hand gripping the wooden frame so tightly his knuckles had gone white. The 3 dogs, Ranger, Scout, and Belle, huddled behind him, their usual courage replaced by an uncharacteristic trembling that seemed to echo through their entire bodies. In all his 62 years, through gunfights and manhunts, through the loss of everything he'd ever held dear, Elijah had never felt fear quite like this. The lantern's flame danced in the mountain breeze that swept through the open door, casting shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own across the rough-hewn walls. The cabin looked exactly as he'd left it a decade ago, the same handmade furniture he'd crafted during their brief, precious months together, the same iron cookstove where she'd made coffee strong enough to wake the dead, the same faded quilt hanging over the back of her favorite chair, but it was the journal that held his attention like a man staring into his own grave. The leather cover was worn smooth from countless hands, bound with the same careful stitching that had mended his shirts and patched his wounded heart during the happiest months of his life. Catherine's journal, the one she'd written in every evening by lamplight, recording her thoughts about their outlaw days, their dreams of a life beyond running and hiding. He'd buried it with her. He remembered placing it in her cold hands before they'd lowered her into the rocky Montana soil behind the cabin. Yet here it lay, open to pages that shouldn't exist, filled with words written in her unmistakable script. "Easy now," he whispered to the dogs, though his own voice cracked like autumn leaves. "Easy." Ranger, the eldest of the 3, a grizzled German shepherd with scars from a dozen fights, whined low in his throat and pressed closer to Elijah's leg. Scout, lean and quick as his name suggested, kept his nose raised, testing the air for scents that didn't belong. Belle, the youngest, a mountain cur with one blue eye and one brown, stayed closest to the door, ready to bolt at the first sign of real danger. These dogs had been his constant companions through 10 years of wandering, through bitter winters when they'd shared body heat in caves and lean summers when they'd all gone hungry together. They'd never shown fear like this, not when they'd faced down wolves, not when they'd encountered bears, not even that terrible night 3 years past when they'd stumbled into a timber rattler's nest. Elijah forced himself to step across the threshold. The floorboards creaked under his weight, the same loose board by the window that Catherine had always meant to fix. The sound triggered a flood of memories so vivid he had to steady himself against the doorframe. Her laughter echoing through these rooms, the way she'd hum old hymns while cooking, the gentle scratch of her pen across paper as she wrote in this very journal, by the light of this very lantern, Catherine Rose Milliken. Even now, her name brought both warmth and pain to his chest. She'd been 28 when they met, a schoolteacher from Denver who'd taken the wrong stagecoach and ended up in the middle of a bank robbery. Most folks would have screamed or fainted, but Catherine had looked straight at him over the barrel of his Colt 45 and said, "I surely hope you gentlemen have a good reason for this disruption, because I have 23 children waiting for their arithmetic lesson." That had been the beginning of everything. She'd ridden with their gang for 3 years, not as a gun hand, but as their conscience, their voice of reason, and eventually their way out. It was Catherine who'd convinced them to stop robbing innocent folks and focus on the corrupt railroad barons who were stealing land from settlers. Catherine who'd planned their final score, enough money to disappear forever and start honest lives somewhere, far from wanted posters and bounty hunters. Catherine who died the night before they could make their escape. Elijah moved closer to the table, his boots echoing in the silence. The journal lay open to a page dated just 3 days ago. 3 days ago. His hands shook as he read the familiar handwriting. My dearest Elijah, if you're reading this, then you've finally come home. I know how much it hurts to be in this place again. I know you've been carrying the weight of that night for 10 long years, blaming yourself for something that was never your fault. But there are things you don't know, things that happened after you left. The truth has been waiting here all this time, patient as the mountains themselves. The words seemed to blur before his eyes. He blinked hard, convinced he was seeing things, that grief and exhaustion had finally broken his mind. But when he looked again, the words remained, written in Catherine's careful script, the same way she dotted her I's and crossed her T's. His fingers trembled as he turned the page. Marcus is alive. Eli, I know you thought he died with the others that night, but he survived. He's been here, watching over this place, watching over your memory of us. The man who betrayed our gang, it wasn't who you think. The real betrayer is still out there, and innocent people are paying the price for our silence. Marcus Sullivan. The name hit him like a physical blow. Marcus had been his closest friend in the gang, closer than a brother. They'd ridden together for 7 years, shared everything from bullets to bread. When the law had finally caught up with them that terrible night, Elijah had watched Marcus fall beneath a hail of gunfire, had seen his body tumble into the rushing waters of Crow Creek, or thought he had. The dogs whined again, and Scout began pacing near the window. Elijah looked up from the journal to see what had captured their attention. Outside, the last light of evening was fading behind the pine-covered ridges, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. But there, just at the edge of the clearing, he caught a glimpse of movement, a figure stepping back into the shadows of the trees. Too distant to make out clearly. Someone was watching the cabin. Elijah's hand moved instinctively to the spot where his gun belt used to hang, but he'd given up wearing iron years ago. These days, he carried nothing more dangerous than a hunting knife and the weight of his memories. But old habits died hard, and the feeling of being watched by unfriendly eyes was something a man never forgot. He turned back to the journal, reading faster now. There's a woman named Sarah Chen who's been asking questions about the disappearances around these parts. She's a school teacher like I was, but she's got the heart of a tracker. She knows about the symbols carved in the trees, knows about the patterns. Trust her, Eli. She might be the key to finally setting things right. The entry ended there, but as Elijah flipped through the remaining pages, he found more entries scattered throughout, some dated weeks ago, others just days past. All in Catherine's handwriting, all speaking of things that had happened since her death. It was impossible, but the evidence lay before him, in her own careful words. A sound from outside made all 3 dogs growl low and deep. Footsteps on the wooden porch, slow and deliberate. Elijah closed the journal and slipped it into his coat pocket, then moved to the window. Through the dusty glass, he could see a slight figure approaching the door. A woman with dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, wearing sturdy traveling clothes and carrying herself with the confident stride of someone accustomed to rough country. She knocked 3 times, then called out in a clear, strong voice, "Mr. Wade!" "My name is Sarah Chen. I believe we need to talk about Catherine Milliken and what's been happening in these mountains." Elijah's heart nearly stopped. How could this stranger know Catherine's name? How could she know his? He'd been careful to leave no traces, to become just another drifter with no past and no future. Yet here was a woman standing on his doorstep, speaking names that should have been buried with the dead. The dogs had stopped growling, which surprised him. They were excellent judges of character, and their acceptance of this stranger's presence told him more than words could. Still, he approached the door cautiously, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. "What do you want?" He called through the wooden planks. "To help you find the truth about what really happened 10 years ago," Sarah replied. "And to stop what's happening now before more innocent people disappear." Elijah opened the door slowly, studying the woman on his porch. She was younger than Catherine had been, perhaps in her early 30s, with intelligent dark eyes and the kind of steady gaze that suggested she'd seen more of the world's harsh realities than most schoolteachers. There was something in her bearing that reminded him of Catherine, a quiet strength, a sense of purpose that couldn't be shaken by fear or uncertainty. "You mentioned disappearances," he said carefully. Sarah nodded. 7 people in the last 2 months. All last seen in this area. All vanished without a trace, like the earth just swallowed them whole. She glanced past him into the cabin, and her eyes widened slightly when she saw the burning lantern. "Someone's been maintaining this place. Someone who doesn't want it forgotten. How do you know about Catherine?" "Because I've been researching the history of this land, Mr. Wade. I know about the gang that used to operate out of these mountains. I know about the night they were betrayed and scattered to the winds. And I know that one member of that gang survived and has been living as a ghost ever since." She paused, studying his weathered face. "I also know that the man who betrayed your gang is still alive. And he's using these mountains for something terrible." The words sent a chill down Elijah's spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. He stepped aside, gesturing for Sarah to enter the cabin. The dogs, after a moment's careful sniffing, seemed to accept her presence and settle down by the fireplace. "You'd better start from the beginning," Elijah said, settling into the chair across from where Catherine used to sit. "And don't leave anything out." Sarah settled into Catherine's old chair with the same unconscious grace that had once filled this room with warmth. She reached into her leather satchel and withdrew a worn notebook, its pages filled with neat handwriting and careful sketches. But first, she pulled out something that made Elijah's breath catch in his throat, a pressed wildflower, delicate purple petals preserved between sheets of glass. "I found this tucked between pages of local property records," Sarah said, holding the flower up to the lantern light. "Larkspur, the same kind mentioned in Catherine Milliken's teaching journal from Denver, the one the school district preserved after her disappearance. She used to press flowers with her students to teach them about local plants." Elijah stared at the flower, memory flooding back like spring runoff. Catherine had always collected wildflowers, pressing them in whatever book she happened to be reading. She'd filled their cabin with mason jars of dried blooms, claiming they brought beauty to their fugitive life. Larkspur had been her favorite. She said the purple reminded her of mountain sunsets. "Where exactly did you find this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "In a surveyor's report from 1923, tucked between pages about mineral rights for this very property. Someone placed it there deliberately, Mr. Wade. Someone who knew what it would mean." Sarah opened her notebook to a page covered with detailed sketches. "But that's not what brought me here tonight. It's these." She turned the notebook toward him, revealing drawings of carved symbols, angular marks cut deep into tree bark, arranged in patterns that seemed both random and purposeful. Elijah recognized them immediately. He'd seen similar markings during his outlaw days, usually in places where gangs left messages for each other. But these were different, older somehow, and far more complex. "I found 47 of these symbols carved into trees within a 5-mile radius of your cabin," Sarah continued. "They're fresh cuts, made within the last few months. Someone's been marking territory, creating a pattern that leads to something important." "You said people were disappearing." Sarah's expression grew grave. "Tom Henderson, a trapper, vanished 6 weeks ago. His camp was found intact. Coffee still warm in the pot, but no sign of struggle. Mary and James Whitfield, newlyweds heading west, disappeared from the old mining road 3 weeks back. Their wagon was discovered overturned, but again, no bodies, no blood, nothing to suggest what happened to them." She flipped to another page showing a rough map of the area. "All the disappearances follow the same pattern. People last seen within this circle," she traced a finger, around a large area centered on Elijah's cabin. and all near locations where these symbols have been carved. The three dogs had been resting quietly by the fireplace. But now Scout raised his head, ears pricked toward the window. A moment later, all three were on their feet, hackles raised. Outside, something moved through the underbrush, too heavy to be a deer, too deliberate to be a bear. Elijah rose slowly, motioning for Sarah to stay quiet. He moved to the window and peered through the glass into the gathering darkness. The moon was rising, casting silver light across the clearing, and in that pale illumination he saw them. Footprints in the soft earth around the cabin. Fresh prints, made by someone wearing boots with a distinctive pattern on the sole. "We're being watched," he whispered. Sarah joined him at the window, her notebook clutched tightly in her hands. "I've felt it for days, the sensation of eyes following me through the forest. Whoever's behind the disappearances knows I've been asking questions." "What kind of questions?" "The kind that dig up buried secrets." She returned to her chair, but kept her voice low. "I've been corresponding with law enforcement agencies across 3 territories, tracking similar disappearance patterns. What I found was disturbing. Mr. Wade, these kinds of vanishings, they've been happening for 20 years, always in remote areas, always leaving behind the same kind of symbols." 20 years, Elijah repeated, the significance not lost on him. "That would put it right around the time our gang was scattered." Sarah nodded. "I believe someone from your past is using these mountains as a base of operations for something far worse than simple robbery. The symbols, the disappearances, even the maintenance of this cabin, it's all connected to that night 10 years ago." Elijah moved away from the window and picked up the journal from where he'd set it on the table. He opened to one of Catherine's impossible entries and showed it to Sarah. "Then you'll want to see this." Sarah read in silence, her eyes growing wider with each line. When she finished, she looked up at Elijah with a mixture of wonder and fear. "This is Catherine's handwriting? I'd stake my life on it. I spent 3 years watching her write in this journal every night. But Sarah, she's been dead for 10 years. I buried this journal with her own hands. Unless she wasn't really dead." The words hung in the air between them, like smoke from a dying fire. "Mr. Wade, what if Catherine survived that night? What if someone wanted you to believe she was dead?" The possibility hit Elijah like a physical blow. He'd never questioned what he'd seen that terrible night. Catherine's still form lying in the dirt, blood pooling beneath her head, no breath, no pulse. But he'd been wounded himself, half blind from smoke and fear, desperate to escape before more law officers arrived. In his haste to bury her and flee, had he made a terrible mistake? "No," he said firmly. I held her in my arms. She was gone. Then someone else is writing in her journal, someone who knew her well enough to perfectly mimic her handwriting. Sarah stood and began pacing the small cabin. "Someone who wants you to come back here, who's been maintaining this place as a shrine or a trap." A new sound from outside made them both freeze. The soft whinny of a horse, quickly muffled, as if someone had covered the animal's nose. Elijah motioned for Sarah to blow out the lantern. In the sudden darkness, they moved to opposite windows, peering out into the moonlit clearing. 3 riders sat their horses at the edge of the tree line, dark silhouettes against the silver night. They made no attempt to approach or announce themselves, simply watched the cabin with the patient stillness of predators waiting for prey to make a mistake. "Friends of yours?" Sarah whispered. "No friends of mine would sit their horses like that," Elijah replied. "Those are men accustomed to violence, waiting for the right moment to use it." The dogs remained alert, but didn't bark or growl, a sign that they sensed the watching men were keeping their distance for now. Ranger, the pack leader, positioned himself between the door and his human companions, ready to fight if necessary, after what felt like an hour, but was probably only minutes. The riders turned their horses and disappeared back into the forest. The message was clear. They knew where Elijah was, and they could find him whenever they chose. "We need to leave," Sarah said once the hoofbeats had faded. "Tonight, no." Elijah's voice carried the finality of a man who'd made his decision. "I ran once from this place, spent 10 years wandering like a ghost. I won't run again. If someone's using Catherine's memory to draw me back here, then I need to know why." And if people are disappearing because of something connected to my past, then I have a responsibility to stop it. Sarah studied his weathered face in the moonlight streaming through the window. Then you'll need help. These symbols, the disappearances, the way those men were watching us, this is bigger than one man can handle alone. What are you proposing? Partnership. You know these mountains and the history of what happened here. I know how to track, how to research, how to piece together patterns. Together, we might be able to solve this mystery before anyone else disappears. Elijah looked down at the three dogs, who were now resting but still alert. They'd been his only companions for a decade, the only witnesses to his exile and wandering. Now this stranger was offering to share the burden he'd carried alone for so long. Why? He asked. Why risk your life for people you don't even know? Sarah's answer was simple and direct. Because someone has to. Because those missing people have families waiting for them to come home. And because I have a feeling that what's happening here is just the beginning of something much worse. Outside, an owl called from the darkness, its voice echoing across the mountain silence. Somewhere in that vast wilderness, answers waited in the shadows, answers that would require courage to uncover and strength to survive. Elijah extended his hand to Sarah. Partners, then. But we do this my way, on my terms. These mountains can be unforgiving to folks who don't respect their dangers. Sarah clasped his weathered hand in her smaller but equally determined one. Agreed. Now let's start by figuring out what these symbols really mean. Dawn broke gray and cold over the Montana wilderness, with frost painting the pine needles silver and mist rising from the valleys like spirits departing the earth. Elijah had barely slept, spending most of the night watching the tree line for movement, while Sarah dozed fitfully in Catherine's old chair. The three dogs had maintained their vigil by the windows, their instincts telling them that danger still lurked in the surrounding forest. By first light, they were ready to begin their investigation. Sarah had spread her notebook and sketches across the table, creating a rough map of the carved symbols she'd discovered. Elijah studied the patterns with the practiced eye of a man who'd spent years reading trail signs and hidden messages. These aren't random, he said, tracing connections between the symbol locations with his finger. See how they form a rough circle around the cabin, then branch out toward the old mining areas? Someone's marking territory, creating boundaries, or leading to something specific, Sarah added. She pulled out a surveyor's compass and laid it over her map. If we follow the line of symbols from the eastern ridge, they point directly toward Copper Creek Canyon, the same place where your gang used to cache supplies. The mention of Copper Creek brought back a flood of memories. The canyon had been their primary hideout during the winter months, sheltered from wind and hidden from prying eyes. Catherine had loved the place, said the way sunlight filtered through the rock formations reminded her of stained glass windows in the church, where she'd taught Sunday school as a girl. We used caves in that canyon to store everything from ammunition to stolen gold, Elijah said. If someone's been using our old hiding places, that would explain how they know so much about our operations. They gathered their gear quickly, Sarah's research materials, Elijah's hunting knife, and the few supplies he'd brought. Enough food and water for a day's trek through rough country. The three dogs seemed eager to be moving again, their restlessness suggesting they too felt the oppressive weight of being watched. As they prepared to leave the cabin, Elijah took one last look at the room where he'd spent his happiest and most painful memories. The journal lay on the table where they'd left it, open to one of Catherine's impossible entries. On impulse, he closed it and tucked it into his coat pocket. If they were walking into danger, he wanted her words close to his heart. The forest was alive with the sounds of morning, birdsong and the rustle of small creatures moving through the underbrush. But beneath the natural symphony, Elijah's trained ear caught something else, the distant crack of a breaking branch, the whisper of fabric against bark. They were still being followed, but their watchers were keeping a respectful distance for now. Sarah proved to be an excellent tracker, moving through the wilderness with the quiet confidence of someone who'd spent considerable time in wild places. She stopped frequently to examine trees marked with the carved symbols, making notes in her book and taking measurements with a small ruler. The cuts are all made with the same tool, she observed, running her fingers over a particularly deep carving. Something sharp and narrow, maybe a hunting knife or an awl. And they're all carved at the same height, suggesting our marker is about 6 feet tall. They found the first symbol carved into a massive ponderosa pine about a quarter-mile from the cabin. It was a complex design, intersecting lines forming a pattern that looked almost like a star with additional marks radiating outward. Below it, carved in smaller letters, was a single word, remember. Remember what? Sarah asked. Elijah studied the carving with growing unease. The word was etched in a style he recognized, the same careful lettering that Marcus had used when leaving messages for the gang during their outlaw days. Marcus had been their communication specialist, the one who'd developed the code they used to leave information for each other without risking discovery by law enforcement. It's Marcus, he said quietly. This is his work. They continued following the trail of symbols, each one growing more complex and urgent in its design. The dogs ranged ahead of them, noses to the ground, following scents that led in the same direction as the carved markers. Scout, the quickest of the three, would disappear around bends in the trail, only to return and lead them forward with growing excitement. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the symbols began to tell a story. Some were accompanied by dates carved in the bark, dates that spanned the 10 years since the gang's destruction. Others showed crude maps or directional arrows. One particularly elaborate carving showed what looked like a building or structure hidden among the trees. He's been here all along, Elijah realized. Marcus has been living in these mountains for 10 years, watching, waiting for something. Waiting for you? Maybe. Or waiting for the right time to finish something we started long ago. They reached a small clearing where several trails converged, and here they found the most significant discovery yet. A large boulder had been carved with dozens of symbols, creating a kind of message board or gathering place. But more importantly, they found evidence of recent human habitation, the remains of a small campfire, tracks in the soft earth, and scraps of cloth caught on nearby branches. Belle, the youngest dog, began whining and pawing at a patch of disturbed earth near the base of the boulder. When Elijah investigated, he found buried beneath a thin layer of soil a collection of items that made his blood run cold. Personal belongings, a woman's locket, a man's pocket watch, a child's wooden toy, items that could only have come from the missing persons. Dear God, Sarah breathed, recognizing the significance of the discovery. These are trophies. Someone's been taking keepsakes from the people who've disappeared. Elijah examined each item carefully, his heart heavy with the implications. These weren't random thefts. They were carefully chosen mementos, the kind of things someone would take to remember their victims. But who? Marcus had been many things during their outlaw days, but never a killer of innocent people. A sound from the forest made all three dogs growl in unison, the snap of a twig under a heavy foot. Someone was approaching through the trees, moving with deliberate purpose rather than trying to remain hidden. Elijah motioned for Sarah to take cover behind the boulder while he positioned himself where he could see the approaching figure. A man emerged from the tree line, tall, bearded, wearing clothes that had seen better days, but moving with the fluid grace of someone comfortable in the wilderness. It took Elijah a moment to recognize the face beneath the weathered features and graying beard. But when recognition came, it hit him like a physical blow. Marcus Sullivan stepped into the clearing, his hands raised to show he carried no weapons. 10 years had aged him considerably. His dark hair was now streaked with silver. Deep lines mapped the geography of hard living around his eyes, and his once powerful frame had been whittled down by years of mountain life. But his eyes were the same, sharp and intelligent, holding secrets that time had not dimmed. "Hello, Eli," Marcus said, his voice carrying the weight of a decade's worth of unspoken words. "I've been waiting a long time to have this conversation. For a long moment, the two men simply stared at each other across the clearing, 10 years of separation and unspoken grief hanging between them like morning mist. The three dogs, after their initial alertness, seemed to recognize Marcus despite the years and began approaching him with cautious tail wags. Scout, in particular, seemed to remember the man who had once shared campfire meals and long nights on the trail. Marcus. Elijah's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. I watched you die. I saw you fall into Crow Creek with 3 bullets in your chest. Marcus smiled sadly, reaching down to scratch Scout behind the ears. You saw me fall, but the creek was running shallow that time of year. I caught a fallen log about a mile downstream, crawled out more dead than alive. Took me 6 months to heal up properly, another year to work up the courage to come back to these mountains. Sarah emerged from behind the boulder, her notebook clutched tightly in her hands. She studied Marcus with the careful attention of someone trying to determine if he represented salvation or additional danger. You're the one who's been maintaining the cabin, writing in Catherine's journal, guilty on the first count, innocent on the second. Marcus's expression grew troubled. I've been keeping the cabin from falling apart, yes. Seemed like the least I could do for Eli's memory of her. But I never touched that journal, miss. Never even knew it existed until I heard you two talking about it last night. You were listening to our conversation. I've been watching this place for weeks, ever since the disappearances started getting worse. When I saw Eli come walking up that trail with his dogs, I nearly thought I was seeing a ghost myself. Marcus gestured toward the pile of personal belongings they'd discovered. This is why I finally decided to show myself. Things have gotten bad, and I can't handle it alone anymore. Elijah knelt beside the buried items, his mind racing. If Marcus wasn't responsible for taking these trophies, then someone else was operating in their old territory, someone who knew enough about their past to use it against them. Tell me about the disappearances. Everything you've seen. Marcus settled onto a fallen log, his weathered face grave. Started about 3 months ago with small things. Missing livestock, abandoned campsites, tracks that didn't belong to any animal I could identify. Then Tom Henderson vanished from his trapline. I found his camp exactly like the authorities described, everything in place except Tom himself. Did you see who took him? Not directly, but I found sign. Boot prints with a distinctive pattern, same ones I've been tracking around your cabin. Whoever's doing this is organized. Eli, they're using our old trails, our old hiding places, like they know this territory as well as we do. Sarah had been taking notes throughout the conversation, but now she looked up with a frown. Mr. Sullivan, you said you've been living in these mountains for 10 years. Have you seen anyone else from your old gang during that time? The question seemed to hit Marcus like a physical blow. He was quiet for a long moment, staring down at his worn boots. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a decade's worth of guilt and regret. There's something I need to tell you both. Something I should have confessed years ago. He reached into his coat and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper, old, yellowed with age but carefully preserved. This is a wanted poster from our gang's final days. Take a look at it, Eli. Look real careful. Elijah unfolded the paper with trembling hands. It showed 5 faces arranged around a central image, the core members of their gang during their most active period. There was his own younger face, hard-eyed and determined. Catherine looking somehow both innocent and dangerous. Marcus, before the years had weathered him. And 2 others he remembered with painful clarity, Vincent Cross, their explosives expert, and Jake Morrison, the youngest member of their group, but it was the text at the bottom of the poster that made Elijah's blood run cold. Under each face was listed their fate: killed, 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 unknown, escaped. Vincent Cross, Sarah read aloud. Status unknown. That's right, Marcus said quietly. Vincent was never accounted for that night. We all assumed he died in the explosion when they hit our main camp, but his body was never found. I've been wondering for 10 years if maybe he survived, if maybe he's been biding his time, waiting for the right moment to settle old scores. The implications hit Elijah like an avalanche. Vincent Cross had been brilliant with explosives, but he'd also been ruthless in ways that had made even hardened outlaws uncomfortable. If Vincent had survived that night and harbored resentment about the gang's destruction, he would certainly have the knowledge and motivation to hunt down the remaining members. Vincent knew about this place, Elijah said slowly. He helped us set up the supply caches in Copper Creek Canyon. He'd know every hiding spot, every escape route, and he'd know how much you cared about Catherine, Marcus added. If he wanted to draw you back here, using her memory would be the perfect bait. Sarah had been studying the wanted poster with intense concentration. This changes everything. If Vincent Cross is alive and operating in this area, then the disappearances aren't random crimes. They're preparation for something bigger. He's been using this time to establish himself, to gather resources, to plan whatever revenge he has in mind. A chill wind swept through the clearing, setting the pine boughs to whispering and carrying with it the scent of distant smoke. Marcus stood abruptly, his head tilted as he listened to sounds beyond normal human hearing. "We need to move," he said urgently. "I smell wood smoke, and it's not coming from any legitimate campfire. Someone's burning something big, something they want to make sure is completely destroyed." The dogs had already caught the scent, their noses raised and their bodies tense with alertness. Belle, the youngest, began whining and pacing toward the north, where a thin column of dark smoke was beginning to rise above the tree line. "The old mining camp," Marcus said, his face pale with sudden understanding. "That's where Vincent would go if he wanted to destroy evidence. There are old buildings there, places where he could have been keeping the missing people." They gathered their belongings quickly, the urgency of the situation overriding any lingering awkwardness of reunion. As they prepared to leave the clearing, Elijah took one last look at the wanted poster, memorizing Vincent's face, the sharp features, the calculating eyes, the thin smile that had once seemed charming but now appeared sinister in hindsight. "How long since you've seen him?" Sarah asked as they began moving through the forest at a rapid pace. 10 years, 3 months, and 16 days, Marcus replied without hesitation. "But a man like Vincent doesn't change much. He'll be older, maybe more careful, but the same ruthless intelligence that made him valuable to our gang will be driving whatever he's planning now." The smoke grew thicker as they climbed toward the mining camp, carrying with it the acrid smell of burning wood and something else, something organic and disturbing that none of them wanted to identify. The dogs moved with increasing urgency, their natural tracking instincts drawing them toward whatever was happening ahead. The old mining camp emerged from the forest like a vision from a fever dream, wreathed in thick smoke that stung their eyes and burned their throats. What had once been a thriving operation during the gold rush days now stood as a collection of weathered buildings and rusted equipment, transformed by Vincent Cross into something far more sinister than its original purpose. The largest building, the old assay office, was fully engulfed in flames that reached toward the grey mountain sky like grasping fingers. But it was what they could see through the smoke that made Elijah's heart sink with dread. Scattered around the burning structure were the remnants of a makeshift camp, crude shelters, supply caches, and most disturbing of all, what appeared to be holding areas constructed from salvaged mining equipment. "Dear God," Sarah whispered, pressing a handkerchief to her nose against the acrid smoke. "He's been keeping people here." Marcus pointed to a series of fresh tire tracks leading away from the camp toward an old mining road that wound down the opposite side of the mountain. "He's moving his operation. This fire isn't an accident. It's Vincent covering his tracks." The 3 dogs spread out across the camp, their noses working frantically as they searched for scents among the chaos. Belle, despite being the youngest, seemed to understand the urgency of their mission. She led them to a partially collapsed mine shaft where they found evidence that chilled them to the bone, personal belongings scattered in the dirt, clear signs that people had been held here against their will. But it was Ranger who made the discovery that changed everything. The old German shepherd began digging frantically at a spot near the mineshaft entrance, whining with an urgency that spoke of something important buried beneath the rocky soil. When Elijah and Marcus helped clear away the loose stones and dirt, they uncovered a small metal box, carefully wrapped in oiled cloth to protect it from the elements. Inside the box was a collection of items that told the story of Vincent's decade-long obsession with revenge. There were photographs of Elijah taken from a distance over the years, showing him in various towns and campsites during his wandering. Letters never sent, filled with Vincent's increasingly unhinged thoughts about betrayal and justice. And most significantly, a silver locket that Elijah recognized immediately. "Catherine's locket," he said, his voice breaking as he held the delicate piece of jewelry in his weathered hands. The silver had been recently polished, maintained with a care that spoke of obsessive devotion. Inside, the tiny photograph of Catherine smiled up at him, her face unmarked by time or tragedy. "She was wearing this the night she died," Marcus said quietly. "I remember seeing it catch the firelight as we carried her to the grave." Sarah examined the locket with the careful attention of someone trained to notice details. "This has been cleaned and polished recently. The chain's been repaired with new links. Someone's been taking very good care of it." The implications were staggering. If Vincent had taken the locket from Catherine's body, it meant he'd been to her grave. But more than that, the careful maintenance suggested an emotional connection that went far beyond simple trophy-taking. Vincent had loved Catherine too, in his own twisted way, and her death had driven him to a decade of careful, patient planning for revenge. A sound from the forest made them all freeze, the rumble of engines approaching through the trees. Vincent's men were returning, probably to ensure the fire had destroyed all evidence of their activities. Marcus grabbed Elijah's arm and pulled him toward a stand of large boulders that would provide cover. "We need to get out of sight," Marcus urged. "If Vincent's with them, he'll recognize you from a mile away." They crouched behind the rocks as two trucks emerged from the tree line, their beds loaded with supplies and equipment. The vehicles stopped at the edge of the burning camp, and several men climbed out to survey the destruction. But it was the figure who emerged from the passenger seat of the lead truck that made Elijah's blood run cold. Vincent Cross had aged, but he was unmistakably the same man who'd ridden with their gang a decade ago. His dark hair was now streaked with silver, and deep lines marked his face, but his movements still carried the same predatory grace that had made him both valuable and dangerous during their outlaw days. He wore modern clothes, jeans and a flannel shirt, but there was something in his bearing that suggested barely contained violence. "Burn it all!" Vincent called to his men, his voice carrying clearly across the smoky clearing. "I want nothing left that could tie us to this place." "We're moving to the secondary location tonight." One of his men approached with obvious reluctance. "Boss, what about the people we've got stashed in the caves?" "Some of them ain't gonna survive another move." Vincent's response was delivered with chilling indifference. "Then they don't survive. We've got what we need from them. The real prize is coming to us." He pulled out a photograph and held it up, a recent image of Elijah that must have been taken during his approach to the cabin. "Elijah Wade has finally come home, just like I knew he would." Catherine's memory was the perfect bait. Sarah grabbed Elijah's arm, her eyes wide with understanding. "He's been orchestrating all of this. The journal entries, the maintained cabin, even bringing you and me together. It's all been part of his plan." Vincent continued issuing orders to his men, but his words were partially lost in the crackling of the flames and the rumble of the truck engines. What came through clearly was his intention to move to another location, taking with him whatever prisoners he still held and continuing his campaign of revenge against the surviving members of his former gang. As the trucks prepared to leave, Vincent paused and looked directly toward the boulder where they were hiding. For a terrifying moment, Elijah was certain they'd been discovered. Vincent's eyes, still sharp and calculating after all these years, seemed to look straight through him. But then he smiled, a cold expression that held no warmth or humor. "I know you're out there, old friend," Vincent called across the burning camp. I know you're watching, listening, trying to figure out how to stop me. But you can't stop what's already been set in motion. Catherine's been waiting for you, Elijah. Waiting in the place where we used to store our most precious treasures. The trucks roared to life and disappeared back into the forest, leaving behind only smoke, ash, and the terrible knowledge that their enemy was not only alive, but had been planning his revenge for 10 long years. The smoke from the burning mining camp still hung in the air like a funeral shroud as they made their way back through the forest, each of them lost in their own dark thoughts. Vincent's words echoed in Elijah's mind. Catherine's been waiting for you in the place where we used to store our most precious treasures. There was only one location that fit that description, the hidden cave system in Copper Creek Canyon, where the gang had kept their most valuable stolen goods. But it was Marcus who broke the heavy silence with words that changed everything. Elijah thought he knew about that terrible night 10 years ago. Eli, there's something else I need to tell you. Something about the night Catherine died. Marcus stopped walking and turned to face his old friend, his weathered face etched with a decade's worth of guilt. What Vincent said back there about Catherine waiting, I don't think he was speaking metaphorically. Sarah looked between the two men, sensing the weight of whatever revelation was coming. What do you mean? Marcus reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper, stained with age and handling. I've been carrying this for 10 years, too much of a coward to show it to anyone. It's a map, Eli. A map Catherine drew the night she died, showing where she wanted to be taken if something happened to her. Elijah unfolded the paper with trembling hands. The map was drawn in Catherine's careful script, showing the layout of Copper Creek Canyon and marking a specific cave with a large X. Around the margins, she'd written notes in her familiar handwriting. If I don't survive, bring me here. Let me rest where we were happiest. He will understand. Where did you get this? I found it in her coat pocket after she was shot. She must have known something was going to happen that night, must have sensed that the betrayal was coming. Marcus's voice was barely above a whisper. But Eli, here's the thing I never told you. Catherine wasn't killed by law officers that night. The words hit Elijah like a physical blow. What are you talking about? I saw the sheriff's men surround our camp. I heard the gunfire. The law officers were there, yes, but they were firing into the air, trying to flush us out rather than kill us. Someone in our gang was supposed to signal them, supposed to make sure they could take us alive for the bounty money. Marcus paused, struggling with the weight of his confession. Catherine figured out who the real betrayer was. She was trying to warn you when Vincent shot her. The forest seemed to spin around Elijah as the implications sank in. Vincent? Vincent killed Catherine. I saw it happen. I was positioned up on the ridge, providing cover fire, when I saw Catherine running toward your position. She was shouting something, trying to warn you about Vincent's deal with the law. That's when Vincent put a bullet in her back, made it look like she'd been caught in the crossfire with the sheriff's men. Sarah had been listening with growing horror, taking notes even as her hands shook with emotion. So, Vincent Cross wasn't just a gang member. He was the one who betrayed everyone to the authorities? Vincent had been planning it for months, Marcus continued. He'd made a deal with the territorial marshals, information about our operations in exchange for amnesty and a cut of the reward money. Catherine found evidence of his correspondence with the law, was going to expose him that night. Elijah felt the world shift beneath his feet as 10 years of guilt and grief rearranged themselves into a new, more terrible pattern. All this time I thought her death was my fault. I thought I'd failed to protect her from the law. Vincent let you think that. Let us all think that. After he shot Catherine, he made sure to position himself where the sheriff's men could put bullets in him, flesh wounds, nothing fatal, but enough to make it look like he'd fought and died with the rest of us. Marcus pulled out another artifact from his coat, a blood-stained map marked with the locations of that night's battle. I drew this the next day, marking where everyone fell. Notice anything strange about Vincent's position? Elijah studied the map, his tactical mind automatically analyzing the positions. After a moment, the discrepancy became clear. He was too far from the main fighting. If he'd really been trying to escape with the rest of us, he would have been moving toward the horses, not away from them. Exactly. Vincent positioned himself where he could take a few non-fatal hits, then slip away in the confusion while we thought he was dead. He's been free for 10 years, while we've been living with the guilt of what we thought was our failure. The 3 dogs had been resting during the conversation, but now they all raised their heads simultaneously, ears pricked toward a sound beyond human hearing. Scout, the quickest, began pacing nervously while Belle whined low in her throat. "Someone's coming," Sarah whispered. Reaching for the notebook where she'd been recording their discoveries, they quickly gathered their belongings and moved off the main trail, taking cover behind a fallen tree. Through the forest came the sound of horses moving at a steady pace, not the hurried flight of people fleeing danger, but the measured approach of hunters who knew exactly where their prey was hiding. 3 riders emerged from the trees, moving with the confidence of men on familiar ground. They wore modern clothes, but carried themselves like frontier hardmen, and each one bore weapons both openly and concealed. At their head rode a figure that made Elijah's blood freeze in his veins. Vincent Cross sat his horse like a man born to the saddle, his silver-streaked hair catching the dappled sunlight filtering through the pine boughs. But it wasn't his appearance that sent chills down Elijah's spine. It was the object hanging from his saddle horn, glinting in the forest light. Catherine's silver locket, polished to a mirror shine, swayed gently as Vincent's horse picked its way along the trail. He was wearing it like a trophy, a constant reminder of the woman whose death had started this decade-long game of revenge. "He's tracking us," Marcus breathed. Vincent always was the best tracker in the gang. "He knows we found his cache, knows we're putting the pieces together," Vincent called out suddenly, his voice carrying clearly through the mountain air. "I know you're close, Elijah. I can feel you out there, wrestling with the truth about what really happened that night. Catherine died because she tried to protect you from me. Now you get to decide whether more innocent people die the same way." The riders continued past their hiding place, but Vincent's message was clear. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about finishing what he'd started 10 years ago, and he was prepared to use innocent lives as leverage to draw Elijah into the open. The forest fell silent after Vincent's riders disappeared down the trail, leaving behind only the whisper of wind through pine needles and the rapid beating of 3 hearts hiding behind the fallen tree. Elijah's mind raced as he processed the implications of everything Marcus had revealed. 10 years of carrying guilt that wasn't his. 10 years of believing Catherine had died because of his failure to protect her from law enforcement, when the truth was far more personal and devastating. Sarah was the first to break the silence. "We need to find where he's holding the prisoners before he decides to use them as bait." She opened her notebook to a page filled with sketches and measurements. "Based on what he said about precious treasures, and considering the cave system you mentioned, I think I can narrow down the possible locations." Marcus studied Sarah's notes with the appreciation of a man who understood the value of careful planning. Vincent always favored the deep caves for storage, places where dampness wouldn't ruin goods, and thieves couldn't stumble across them by accident. There are 3 such caves in Copper Creek Canyon, but only one that would be large enough to hold multiple prisoners. "The Cathedral Cave," Elijah said, the name bringing back memories both beautiful and terrible. Catherine named it that because of the way sound echoed off the walls. "We used it to store our most valuable takes because it had multiple entrances and was nearly impossible to find unless you knew exactly where to look." They began moving through the forest with renewed urgency, following game trails and old mining paths that would keep them away from the main routes Vincent's men might be watching. The 3 dogs seemed to sense the gravity of their mission, moving with the focused intensity of hunters closing in on dangerous prey. As they climbed higher into the mountains, Sarah made a discovery that changed everything they thought they knew about Vincent's operation. Hidden among some rocks near an old mining claim, she found what appeared to be a modern radio transmitter. its antenna carefully camouflaged to blend with the surrounding brush. "This isn't just about revenge," she said, examining the sophisticated equipment. "Vincent's been coordinating with someone outside these mountains. This is military-grade communication gear." Marcus took one look at the radio, and his face went pale. "I've seen equipment like this before, during my army days before I joined up with your gang. Eli, this is the kind of setup you'd use for coordinating large-scale operations, moving people, goods, information across long distances." The implications were staggering. Vincent wasn't just a vengeful former outlaw picking off his old gang members. He was running a sophisticated criminal enterprise, using the remote Montana mountains as a base of operations for something much larger and more dangerous than simple revenge. "Human trafficking," Sarah said quietly, the pieces falling into place in her mind. "The missing persons, the careful selection of victims, the communication equipment. Vincent's been using our gang's old territory to run people through some kind of underground railroad for criminals." Elijah felt sick as the full scope of Vincent's operation became clear. The innocent people who've disappeared, they're not just random victims. They're inventory. They continued toward Copper Creek Canyon, but now they moved with the knowledge that they were walking into something far more dangerous than a simple confrontation with a vengeful former colleague. Vincent had spent 10 years building a criminal empire, and he'd done it using the skills and knowledge he'd gained during his time with their outlaw gang. The radio had yielded one more piece of crucial information, a frequency setting that suggested regular communication schedules. Sarah, with her background in research and investigation, recognized the pattern of numbers as coordinates, not for locations within Montana, but for points hundreds of miles away across multiple states. "This is a network," she said, showing her calculations to the two men. "Vincent isn't working alone, and this operation isn't limited to these mountains. He's part of something national, maybe international in scope." As they approached the entrance to Copper Creek Canyon, the three dogs suddenly became agitated, their hackles rising and their bodies tense with alarm. Scout, the pack's scout, began whining and backing away from the trail ahead. Belle pressed close to Elijah's legs, seeking comfort from whatever danger her instincts detected. Marcus held up his hand for silence, then pointed toward the canyon mouth. There, barely visible among the rocks and scrub brush, were the barrels of rifles pointed in their direction. Vincent had anticipated their approach and set an ambush, but it was what they could hear, echoing from within the canyon, that made their blood run cold. Human voices, crying for help, calling out in desperation. The missing persons were indeed being held in the cathedral cave, and from the sound of their pleas, they were in immediate danger. Vincent's voice boomed from the canyon, amplified by the natural acoustics of the stone walls. "I know you're out there, Elijah. I've been waiting 10 years for this moment, and I'm not going to let a little thing like an ambush spoil it. Walk into my canyon, and we'll finish what we started that night Catherine died. But if you try to bring the law, or if you try any of your old tricks, these innocent people will pay the price for your cowardice." To emphasize his point, they heard the sharp crack of a gunshot, followed by renewed screaming from the prisoners. Vincent wasn't bluffing. He was prepared to kill innocent people to draw Elijah into the open. "He's got us boxed in," Marcus said grimly. "The canyon only has 2 entrances, and I guarantee he's got both of them covered with armed men. If we try to charge in, those prisoners are dead. If we try to circle around and approach from above, we'll be exposed on the canyon rim, where his riflemen can pick us off." Sarah had been studying the terrain with the careful attention of someone trained to notice details others might miss. "There might be another way," she said slowly. "In my research on this area, I found references to an old mine shaft that connects to the cave system from below. If we could access it from the other side of the mountain—" "The Copper King mine," Elijah interrupted, memory flooding back. "Catherine and I explored it once during our time here. She said it reminded her of the underground railways that helped slaves escape to freedom. If it's still possible, we could come up behind Vincent's position. It was a desperate plan, fraught with dangers both known and unknown. The old mine shaft could have collapsed in the years since they'd explored it. They would be moving through darkness, navigating by memory and instinct, while Vincent and his men controlled the high ground above them. But as another gunshot echoed from the canyon, followed by more desperate pleas from the prisoners, they knew they had no choice. Vincent had trapped them into exactly the kind of desperate gamble that had defined their outlaw days. But this time the stakes weren't gold or money. They were innocent lives hanging in the balance. "We go through the mine," Elijah decided. "It's the only way to get close enough to free those people without getting them killed in the process." As they began the treacherous journey around the mountain toward the old mine entrance, none of them spoke of the obvious truth, that Vincent had probably anticipated this move as well, and that they might be walking not toward a rescue, but toward a trap that had been 10 years in the making. The entrance to the Copper King mine yawned before them, like a mouth leading into the earth's belly, framed by rotting timber supports and nearly choked with decades of accumulated debris. What had once been a bustling operation during the height of the gold rush now stood as a monument to abandoned dreams and dangerous passages carved deep into the mountain's heart. Elijah stood at the threshold, one hand resting on the weathered wood of the entrance frame, while memories of exploring these tunnels with Catherine flooded back with painful clarity. She had been fascinated by the mine's history, by the stories of desperate men digging ever deeper into the mountain in search of fortune that always seemed just out of reach. "It's going to be tight going in some places," he warned Sarah and Marcus. "Parts of the tunnel system have probably collapsed over the years, and we'll be moving in complete darkness once we get beyond the first few yards." Sarah had fashioned makeshift torches from broken branches and strips of cloth torn from her jacket, but they all knew the light wouldn't last long in the damp air of the mine. More importantly, any light they carried would announce their presence to anyone waiting in the darkness. Ahead, Marcus checked his old service revolver, the only weapon among the three of them, and counted his remaining ammunition with the careful attention of a man who understood that every bullet would need to count. 6 shots, he said grimly. "Vincent's got at least a dozen men with him, probably more. We're going to need to rely on surprise and the terrain advantage of knowing these tunnels." The 3 dogs seemed reluctant to enter the mine, their instincts warning them about the dangers that lay ahead. But after a moment's hesitation, they followed their human companions into the darkness, their natural loyalty overriding their fear. 20 feet into the tunnel, the last traces of daylight disappeared behind them, swallowed by the mountain's embrace. The air grew thick and musty, filled with the scent of stagnant water and decades of decay. Their footsteps echoed strangely in the confined space, creating an unsettling symphony of sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Stop," Elijah whispered after they'd traveled perhaps 100 yards into the mountain. He pulled out an object he'd been carrying since the morning they'd discovered Vincent's camp, his old Colt .45, wrapped carefully in oiled cloth and hidden in his pack. The weight of the weapon in his hands brought back memories he'd tried to bury for 10 years. "I thought you said you'd given up guns," Sarah whispered. "I had. But when we found that radio equipment, I knew we were walking into something bigger than personal revenge." Elijah's voice carried the weight of a man accepting a burden he'd hoped never to carry again. "This belonged to my father and his father before him. I carried it through 7 years of outlaw life, and I swore I'd never draw it again after Catherine died. But sometimes a man has to break his promises to himself to keep his promises to others." The symbolism wasn't lost on any of them. Elijah Wade was preparing to return to the violent life he'd abandoned, accepting that some evils could only be stopped by meeting them with equal force. It was a decision that marked the end of one chapter of his life and the beginning of another, perhaps his last. They continued deeper into the mine, guided by Elijah's decade-old memories of the tunnel layout. The passage branched in several directions, some leading to dead ends where miners had followed promising veins to disappointing conclusions. Others connecting to the natural cave system that honeycombed the mountain's interior. There, Marcus said, pointing to a section of wall where fresh air was flowing through gaps in the rock. That's got to be the connection to the caves. I can hear water running on the other side, probably the underground stream that flows through Cathedral Cave. Working together, they managed to widen the opening enough for them to squeeze through one at a time. The dogs went first, their smaller size allowing them to navigate the tight passage with relative ease. Sarah followed, then Marcus, with Elijah bringing up the rear. They emerged into a natural cavern lit by shafts of sunlight filtering down from openings high above. The sound of running water was much clearer now, and they could hear something else, human voices echoing from deeper within the cave system. Vincent's prisoners were close, probably no more than a few hundred yards away through the winding passages. But it was what they found in this transition cavern that gave them their first real advantage of the day. Scattered among the rocks were supplies that Vincent's men had obviously stored here as a backup cache: rope, lanterns, even a small arsenal of weapons taken from their victims over the months of kidnapping and trafficking. Vincent always believed in having multiple escape routes and supply points, Marcus said, examining the weapons with professional interest. Looks like he hasn't changed in that respect. Among the supplies, Sarah made a discovery that brought tears to her eyes. A small leather journal, obviously belonging to one of the missing persons, contained a detailed record of their captivity. The writer, a traveling merchant named Thomas Hayes, had managed to keep track of not only his own imprisonment, but also information about the other prisoners, their captors, and most importantly, the layout of the cave system where they were being held. According to this, Sarah said, reading by the dim light filtering from above, there are 11 prisoners still alive, including 2 children. They're being kept in the main chamber of Cathedral Cave, guarded by at least 6 armed men. Vincent himself comes and goes, but he's been spending most of his time coordinating with people outside, apparently planning some kind of major transport operation. The journal also contained disturbing information about Vincent's long-term plans. Hayes had overheard conversations about moving the entire operation to a new location, somewhere with better access to transportation networks and corrupt officials who could be bought. The disappearances in Montana had been just the beginning. Vincent was planning to expand his human trafficking network across the entire Western Territories. We can't let him move those people, Elijah said, the steel in his voice reminiscent of the man who had once led a gang of desperate outlaws. Once they're out of these mountains, we'll never find them again. Marcus had been studying the cave layout described in Hayes's journal, comparing it to his own memories of their gang's time in these caves. There's a narrow ledge about 30 feet up the main wall of Cathedral Cave. If we could get onto it without being seen, we'd have a clear view of the entire chamber and could pick off Vincent's guards one by one. That's a lot of ifs, Sarah pointed out. Getting up there without being detected, having enough ammunition to deal with all the guards, keeping the prisoners safe during a gunfight in an enclosed space. I know, Marcus replied, but it's the only plan that gives us any chance of saving those people. Vincent's not going to negotiate, and he's certainly not going to let them go out of the goodness of his heart. They spent precious minutes planning their approach, using Hayes's detailed observations and their own knowledge of the cave system to work out timing, positioning, and contingencies for when things went wrong, as they almost certainly would. The 3 dogs would serve as early warning, their superior hearing and smell allowing them to detect threats before human senses could register them. As they prepared to move deeper into the cave system, Elijah took one last look at his old Colt 45. The weapon had been with him through the best and worst moments of his outlaw career, had saved his life more times than he could count, and had taken lives he still remembered with regret. Now it would serve one final purpose, not for robbery or personal gain, but for justice and the protection of innocent lives. Catherine, he whispered to the darkness, if you're watching over me, help me do this right. Help me save these people and end Vincent's evil once and for all. The prayer seemed to echo in the stone chamber, mixing with the sound of running water and distant voices to create a symphony of hope and desperation. Above them, somewhere in the maze of passages that led to Cathedral Cave, Vincent Cross was waiting with his prisoners, his guards, and 10 years' worth of carefully planned revenge. The final confrontation was about to begin, and there would be no second chances for any of them. The passage leading to Cathedral Cave stretched ahead of them, like a throat leading into the mountain's heart, narrow and winding, carved by centuries of flowing water into smooth, treacherous curves. Elijah moved first, his hand resting on the grip of his father's colt, while behind him Marcus and Sarah followed with the careful steps of people who understood that one misplaced foot could bring death to them all. The 3 dogs padded silently alongside them, their instincts sharpened to a razor's edge by the scent of danger ahead. Scout, true to his name, ranged slightly ahead, his ears constantly moving as he monitored the acoustic landscape of the cave system. Bell stayed close to Sarah's heels, while Ranger positioned himself between the humans and whatever threats might emerge from the darkness behind them. As they rounded the final bend before Cathedral Cave, the sound of voices became clear and distinct. Vincent's guards were talking among themselves with the casual indifference of men who believed themselves safe from discovery. Their conversation drifted through the stone passages like smoke, carrying information that made Elijah's blood run cold. "Boss says we move them out tomorrow morning," one guard was saying. "Whole operations relocating to that place in Colorado. Better roads, better access to the railroad. What about the old man and his friends?" Another voice asked. "Vincent's been obsessed with settling that score for 10 years. Oh, he'll settle it all right. Plans to make it real personal-like. Says he's got something special planned for Wade, something involving that woman he used to love." Elijah's grip tightened on his weapon until his knuckles went white. The casual way these men spoke of violence, of the prisoners as mere cargo to be moved, of Catherine's memory being used as a tool for torture. It crystallized his resolve in a way that nothing else could have. They reached the entrance to Cathedral Cave, and through a gap in the rock formation, they could see into the vast chamber beyond. The sight that greeted them was both magnificent and horrifying. The cave soared upward into darkness, its walls carved into fantastic shapes by millennia of water action. Shafts of sunlight pierced the gloom from hidden openings far above, creating a natural cathedral that had once moved Catherine to tears of wonder. But now that sacred space had been defiled by Vincent's evil. 11 prisoners sat huddled together in the center of the chamber, bound with ropes and chained to iron stakes driven into the cave floor. Among them, Elijah could see the faces that had haunted missing person reports for months. Tom Henderson, the missing trapper, looking gaunt but alive. Mary and James Whitfield, the young couple whose wagon had been found overturned. Others whose disappearances had been noted but not fully investigated by overwhelmed territorial authorities. 6 guards lounged around the chamber, their weapons within easy reach, but their attention focused on a card game rather than their duties. They had grown complacent during their months of operation, confident that no one would find their hidden base or challenge their authority. At the far end of the chamber, Vincent Cross stood with his back to the entrance, studying something laid out on a makeshift table. Even from a distance, Elijah could see that he wore Catherine's silver locket around his neck, the polished metal catching the filtered sunlight like a beacon of stolen memory. Marcus touched Elijah's shoulder and pointed upward. The ledge they had identified as their best vantage point was accessible through a series of handholds, carved into the cave wall, probably by miners, who had worked this section before abandoning it to the natural cave system. It would require careful climbing in near darkness, but it would position them above the guards with clear shots at all 6 positions. Sarah had pulled from her pocket something that made both men do a double take. A small mirror, the kind a woman might carry for personal grooming. But in her hands, it became a tool for reflecting those precious shafts of sunlight, creating signals that could coordinate their attack or distract the guards at crucial moments. "On my signal," Elijah whispered, pulling out Catherine's wedding ring, the artifact he had carried for 10 years as both burden and reminder. "When I drop this ring, we move. No hesitation, no second chances." The ring caught the dim light as he held it poised over the stone floor. It represented everything he had lost, everything he had failed to protect, and everything he was now fighting to save. When it struck the cave floor, the sound would mark not just the beginning of their assault, but the end of 10 years of guilt and the start of justice long delayed. The wedding ring struck the stone floor of the cave with a sound like a bell tolling for the dead. In that instant, 10 years of planning, grief, and determination crystallized into pure action. Elijah's first shot took down the guard closest to the prisoners, the man dropping his cards and his life simultaneously. Marcus, positioned on the opposite side of the ledge, eliminated the second guard with the precision of a soldier who had never forgotten his training. Sarah's mirror caught a shaft of sunlight and sent it blazing into the eyes of a third guard, blinding him long enough for Elijah's second shot to find its mark. The remaining 3 guards scrambled for cover behind the natural rock formations that dotted the cave floor. But Vincent's voice cut through the chaos like a blade through silk. "Elijah Wade." Vincent's shout echoed off the cave walls, amplified by the natural acoustics, into something that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "I wondered when you'd finally work up the courage to face me." Vincent had taken cover behind the table where he'd been working, but not before grabbing one of the prisoners, a young woman who couldn't have been more than 20, and pressing his gun to her temple. From his elevated position, Elijah could see what had been laid out on that table, and the sight made his blood run cold. It was a collection of personal items from all the missing persons, arranged like trophies. But more disturbing still was a series of photographs showing each victim in their final moments. "You see what your cowardice has cost, old friend," Vincent called out, his voice carrying a manic edge that spoke of years of festering obsession. "Every person who disappeared, every life I've taken or sold into slavery, their blood is on your hands because you ran instead of staying to face the consequences of your actions." The 3 dogs had spread out across the cave floor, moving with the coordinated precision of a pack that had learned to hunt together. Scout darted between rock formations, harassing the remaining guards and preventing them from getting clean shots at the humans on the ledge. Belle used her smaller size to slip through crevices and emerge behind the guards' positions, while Ranger, the pack leader, stalked Vincent himself with the patience of a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. "The only blood on my hands is yours, Vincent." Elijah's voice rang out with the authority of a man who had finally found his purpose again. "Catherine died trying to expose your betrayal, and you've spent 10 years dishonoring her memory with these atrocities." One of the remaining guards made the mistake of breaking cover to get a better shot at Marcus. Sarah's mirror flashed again, and the man found himself staring into a blaze of reflected sunlight that destroyed his night vision. Marcus's revolver spoke once, and another of Vincent's men fell to the cave floor. "Catherine, Catherine, Catherine!" Vincent screamed, his composure finally cracking under the weight of his obsession. "She was supposed to be mine. I loved her first, before you ever laid eyes on her. But she chose a worthless outlaw over a man who would have given her everything." The truth of Vincent's motivation finally emerged, raw and poisonous, in the sacred space of the cave. His betrayal of the gang, his murder of Catherine, his decade of criminal enterprise, it had all been driven by jealousy and rejection, by the inability to accept that the woman he claimed to love had chosen someone else. Vincent's remaining 2 guards were now pinned down by crossfire from the ledge above, but Vincent himself still held his human shield. The young woman in his grasp was trembling with terror, tears streaming down her face as she stared up at the men who represented her only hope of rescue. "Here's how this ends." "Elijah," Vincent called out, pressing his gun harder against the woman's temple. "You come down here, face to face, and we settle this. the way it should have been settled 10 years ago. You and me, no weapons, just our hands, and the truth about who deserves to live and who deserves to die. It was exactly the kind of challenge that Vincent had always favored. Personal, dramatic, designed to feed his need for control and dominance. But Elijah had learned much in his 10 years of wandering, had gained wisdom that his younger outlaw self had never possessed. Instead of responding to Vincent's challenge, Elijah pulled from his pocket the artifact that had started this entire confrontation, the photograph of missing persons that Sarah had shown him days ago. The faces staring back at him from that image represented all the innocent lives that hung in the balance, all the families who deserved to have their loved ones returned safely. "You're right, Vincent," Elijah called down, his voice steady and calm. "This should have been settled 10 years ago. But not the way you think." Ranger chose that moment to make his move, emerging from the shadows behind Vincent with the silent grace of a predator striking. The big German shepherd launched himself at Vincent's gun hand, his jaws clamping down on the wrist with bone-crushing force. 3 days after the confrontation in Cathedral Cave, Elijah Wade stood once again on the porch of his weathered mountain cabin. But this time, he was not alone. The 3 dogs rested peacefully in the afternoon sunshine, their coats still bearing the dust of their underground adventure, but their spirits bright with the satisfaction of a job well done. Sarah Chen sat in Catherine's old rocking chair, writing carefully in a new journal, not one filled with impossible entries from the dead, but one dedicated to recording the true story of what had happened in these mountains. The territorial marshals had come and gone, taking Vincent Cross and his surviving men into custody, along with enough evidence to dismantle a human trafficking network that had stretched across 5 territories. The 11 rescued prisoners were now safely reunited with their families, their stories of captivity providing authorities with leads that would help identify and prosecute Vincent's confederates in other regions. Vincent himself would never stand trial. When Ranger had broken his gun hand, the weapon had discharged, and in the confusion that followed, Vincent had fallen from the rocky ledge where he'd been holding his hostage. The fall hadn't killed him immediately, but it had left him broken and defeated, ranting about Catherine's betrayal and his own twisted vision of justice until his last breath rattled from his lungs in the depths of Cathedral Cave. Marcus Sullivan sat at the rough-hewn table, leaning the same service revolver that had helped save so many lives. The years of isolation and guilt had lifted from his shoulders like morning mist, replaced by the quiet satisfaction of a man who had finally been able to make amends for past mistakes. He had decided to stay in the mountains, not as a hermit haunted by the past, but as a guardian, watching over the trails and hidden places where evil men might again try to establish their operations. "The journal entries," Sarah said, looking up from her writing. "We never did figure out who was writing in Catherine's hand." Elijah smiled, reaching into his coat pocket to pull out the leather-bound book that had started their entire adventure. "I think I know." He opened to one of the impossible entries and held it up to the light streaming through the cabin window. "Look at the paper itself, not just the writing." Sarah examined the page with the careful attention that had made her such an effective investigator. After a moment, her eyes widened with understanding. "The paper's different. These pages were inserted between the original entries, probably by someone who had access to Catherine's personal effects." "Vincent," Marcus said quietly. "He must have taken samples of her handwriting when he robbed her grave for the locket, practiced copying her style, then used it to create the bait that would draw Elijah back here." It was a chilling testament to the depth of Vincent's obsession, not content with simply killing Catherine. He had spent years learning to forge her handwriting, creating false entries that would torment the man she had truly loved. Even in death, he had tried to use her memory as a weapon, but there was one entry in the journal that remained unexplained, written on paper that matched the original stock, and in handwriting that seemed somehow different from Vincent's careful forgeries. Sarah read it aloud, her voice soft with wonder. My dearest Elijah, if you're reading this, then the truth has finally come to light. I never blamed you for what happened that night. I never blamed you for failing to save me. The only thing I ever wanted was for you to forgive yourself and find peace. Now you have friends to help carry the burden, and maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all any of us can ask for, that we don't have to face our darkest moments alone. The three friends sat in comfortable silence as the meaning of those words settled into their hearts. Whether the entry was Catherine somehow reaching across the veil of death, or simply the product of their own need for closure and healing, it offered exactly what Elijah had needed to hear for 10 long years. Sarah closed her new journal and set it aside, then reached into her bag to pull out something that made both men catch their breath, a packet of wildflower seeds. The same larkspur variety that Catherine had once pressed between the pages of her books. I thought we might plant these around the cabin, she said simply. Create something beautiful in a place that's seen so much sorrow. Marcus nodded his approval. Catherine would have liked that. She always said beauty was the best way to fight back against ugliness in the world. As evening approached, they prepared a simple meal together, sharing stories and plans for the future. Sarah had been offered a position with the Territorial Marshal's Office, helping to investigate cases involving missing persons and organized criminal activities. Her experience with Vincent's network had proven invaluable in understanding how such operations functioned. Marcus would remain as caretaker of the mountain property, but not as a hermit. He planned to establish a way station for legitimate travelers, offering shelter and guidance to those who needed safe passage through the treacherous mountain terrain. And Elijah, for the first time in 10 years, he was truly free to choose his own path. The guilt that had driven him into exile was gone, replaced by the knowledge that he had honored Catherine's memory by protecting innocent lives and bringing justice to those who deserved it. He could go anywhere, do anything, be anyone he chose to be, but as he watched the sunset paint the mountain peaks in shades of gold and purple, as he listened to his friends planning their futures and felt the warm presence of the 3 dogs who had shared his journey, Elijah realized that maybe he had already found what he'd been searching for all along. Sometimes coming home isn't about returning to a place. It's about finding the people who make you want to stay.